name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 22nd Sunday after Pentecost for the week of November 9th, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited. We're nearing the end here of this church year. We're wrapping up Luke. We're getting some interesting texts, things that are challenging, things that are allowing us to think a little bit deeper on different things and being able to contemplate. And again, we're also moving into this season of the year that I think we do a lot of reflection anyways. We're thinking about what is life all meaning? What is the year all meant? How has life kind of progressed? Because when we move into Advent, we move into these holiday times of year. Here in the United States, you have Thanksgiving, then you have Christmas and New Year's. This idea of reflection starts to come up a little bit more and more. And I think that's a good frame of reference in certain ways to be thinking about these texts and also recognizing that we can't get caught up into that. And that's where I think in certain aspects, it brings us back to the question for last week, which was, where have you grown this year? And I know for me, that has been a big thing for me. There has been a lot of growth this year. And even just thinking about this podcast, we worked and had an interview podcast this year. I've been working on a couple different things behind the scenes to try getting some more of those to you next year and hopefully having some more of a regular cadence with that. One of the things I'll state right here and right now, if you know of people or have somebody who you think would be a good interview or somebody who I should be in touch with, shoot me an email, reach out to me, connect with me. I would love to have some of those conversations and see if they're a good fit for us to be able to have some of those interviews with. And there's a couple people I know I'm going to be reaching out to and setting up some of that stuff so we can have some of those coming out. But I also know for me, one of the big things too has just been trying to upgrade different aspects of the podcast. There's some different recording gear I've been using, trying to figure out ways just to make it sound maybe a little bit better. And maybe you didn't notice, maybe you have. Just working on some of those different things, helping even just the growth within that. And I think about the ebbs and flows throughout the year. I know there's been some very difficult times throughout this year where I have really been wondering at times how much is left in the tank. And then there's been some changes that I've done that has refilled the tank a lot and really helped me be able to move forward. And I think had some really good conversations with these texts, with science this year as well. And so we'll get into that as we get to the birthday podcast at the end of the year. But I think there's a lot of ways when we look and think about our lives, we should be seeing this movement of growth. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's linear, that it's perfectly straight, but that there's some ebbs and flows, but there's still movement. There's still progression forward. There's still ways in which we can look back and see that I'm working on that growth or there is growth happening. These are really important things for us to be doing. And I think it's vital for us to be able to continue to be working within our faith and continuing to moving forward in our faith and making sure that we are still growing in the word, and getting things out means that we also need to be growing ourselves. So let's just jump into it this week. The first reading is from Haggai chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. This is one of those moments here where Haggai has recognized there's some disruption, there's things going on where the people are needing that bit of reminder of who God is. And it's this moment here in this text of reminding the people that God is still in the temple, God is still with them, and reminding them of these different things, how God has led them through Egypt and took them out of Egypt and gone through the trials and tribulations. Why would God not be with them still in this time, in this place where, yes, there's times where this feels hard, there's things that it feels difficult, but recognizing within that God is still with them. One of the Psalms then you can potentially have with this then is Psalm 145 verses 1 to 5 and 15 through 21. This then is a psalm that's recognizing the praise and the aspiration of who God is and recognizing that this is something not necessarily that we're bragging about when we're talking about it, but it's this recognition on remembering and helping us to continue that legacy on of reminding us of the work that God has done. We see that specifically in verse 4 of the majesty of what God has done. He fulfills his promises, that we do not have to fear as we cry out to God, recognizing that God has been there with us throughout the whole time. The other psalm that goes with that you can potentially then use is also Psalm 98, the first 9 verses of that. And this is, again, a praise psalm recognizing the joy, the victory of what God has done for us. And this should bring forth joy. This should bring forth praise. This should bring forth, let's be playing instruments, and recognizing also how creation in and of itself is also giving praise to the presence of God and who God is. The other alternative Old Testament text that you can use this week is out of Job, chapter 19, verses 23 to 27a. Arguably, this is a very familiar part of Job, specifically looking at verse 25, "For I know that my vindicator or redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth." This recognition on how when everything has gone on, and especially what has all gone on for Job up to this point, that as everything may be taken away from me, I still get to go and spend time with God, and that I'm still going to be in God's sight, in front of God, recognizing who God is, and that all these things that potentially I'm trying to figure out, trying to understand, that I will be able to see more clearly when I'm right there with God. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 17, the first 9 verses of this. This is a psalm crying out to God, recognizing that the people have gone through some difficult times. There's moments here where I'm tried to stay the path the best I can. I am not slipping, God. I am still with you, even though there's chaos all around me, that I'm still inclining my ear to you. I'm still looking for that steadfast love and still trying to seek it out and be that, and recognizing that you are the one that's guiding me and trying to steer me with where I need to go, even though there is tons of chaos around me. The second reading then, or epistle text, is from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 5 and 13 to 17. And this then is recognizing that in this moment here, parts of the text that are cut out is that there's some doubt and questioning about who Paul was and what was all going on. But it's this recognition here of we are sticking to the words of what Christ was telling us to do. We are looking to Christ for that guidance. And as long as we continue to look for the salvation of who God is through what we saw through Jesus Christ and continue to pursue that and pursue that truth, that then God will continue to be with us. That as there is things that are going on and there's rumors being spread, that we continue to seek what Jesus has said, who God has said to be, and continue to seek that. And that's when we will figure things out. The gospel text this week then is out of Luke chapter 20, verses 27 to 38. This is a moment where we have the Sadducees questioning some things for Jesus. Now, recognize the Sadducees, these are a subsect of Jews who do not believe in the resurrection. And in this case, they are also in the temple. And so they go through some old law here where there is a man who has 7 brothers. And according to the law laid out for Moses, the first brother marries this woman, doesn't have any children, and they go through all the brothers, end up marrying this woman, and none of them have children. And so they're asking, who then is married essentially to this woman? Who is the owner of this woman in a way? And Jesus responds basically with, you're not understanding what divine things are. It's one of these moments that I wish that Jesus had said what we hear in other places. You are focused on human things, not divine things, is basically what Jesus is stating. You are taking this construct of what you are understanding marriage to be and is stretching it way beyond what we are looking at for heaven, and recognizing that God is still trying to speak to them and coming together, and that this is much more about living this out and being together as a family than looking at who's going to belong to who. And we get in verse 38, now he is God, not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. This recognition on how we are all part of the family of God. We are all with the belief and welcoming into this family. We are part of something that is living, that is breathing, and that we are going and joining the saints together as this big, large family that is very much alive, instead of worrying about who belongs to who. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their sermon brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, directions, things to be thinking about, ways to be looking at the text. It's an amazing resource. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having art, which can be super important and really helpful to be looking at and to thinking about how have other people interpreted these texts. What are some different ways to be looking at this? Prayers, hymns, colors, even just some daily readings to get you into these texts to help prepare you for worship. Remember, these are resources not only for the preachers to be getting ready for their sermon and for them to lead worship on Sunday morning, but this is also an opportunity for you as someone who is sitting in the pews to be getting into these texts, getting ready, getting warmed up, just like anybody as an athlete. You still prepare, you do practice. Make sure that you're looking at some of these different things to prepare you for worship so that you are able to get the most out of that worship experience. And I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library to help you get ready and prepared for that. Finally, I'd recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable or the Green Blades Rising publication, which is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies around the upper Midwest of the United States, but also beyond. And it's going through and thinking about things from a lot of an ecological lens, either having these weekly reflections going along with the lectionary, just like what I am week after week, but also having this newsletter that includes all that, but also a lot of additional resources and things to be thinking about from more of an ecological lens. So if you enjoy this podcast and going and digging into these texts for half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy these resources. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. That'll be the first link down in the references section of the show notes. Jesus talks to the Sadducees and is trying to have them get their head around this idea of how you are understanding things is not the way that God works. The way that you are understanding things is not the way that God works. It's not the way that God designed it. It's not the way that the world fully works. It's the way that you are understanding that the world works. And this is something that is a common theme throughout our history of life here on earth. We've talked about it before, talking about how before Copernicus, we thought that the earth was the center of our universe and thus everything revolved around us. And when we went to this more heliocentric model where we're revolving around the sun, this changes our idea and concept of how we relate to space, to the solar system, to the universe. It changes how we look at things, how things are understood. Biology and evolution is another one, talking about Darwin and Wallace. We've talked about that before, and the theory of evolution and how that changed things dramatically. And even Gregor Mendel going through his Punnett squares and talking about his pea plants for early genetic work transformed how we looked at things. But even in that case, the Punnett squares coming from Darwin came out in the 1860s, late 1860s, and it wasn't until the early 1900s where 4 different scientists independently picked that stuff up to really dig back into genetic work. And it, through time, changed how we saw the world, how we understood things, how we understood how God made things work. But this week, I wanted to dig into one particular person who I think single-handedly really exemplifies this idea of, even though people may not be believing what you're saying, to not lose faith in it, to not lose hope in it, just like we're not supposed to lose hope in God, even when things are difficult and hard, and recognizing that you will still see the light of where God is steering you through the chaos that's going on around you. And I think there is no one better to talk about for this. Barbara McClintock. Now, Barbara McClintock is probably not a name that is super familiar to you, but in reality, it really should be a name that we recognize a lot more, not only because she is an early woman scientist, which is an amazing aspect in and of itself, but the amount of things that she was able to get into, have her hands in, and help us change how we understand things. And we'll get into, she was arguably at least 15 to 20 years ahead of her time for the majority of her career, which is incredible. So McClintock went to Cornell University for undergrad, master's, and doctorate in botany. And she decided to then go into research on maize or corn genetics and studied cytogenetics to bring together classic genetics, which had been come out of Gregor Mendel, along with what we understood with cells and early cell theory and things of that nature. So in the early 1930s, she then was able to prove that there was genes on chromosomes and was able to start to lay out the early understanding of the crossover material that we see in the process of meiosis today within sex cells and how that process starts to happen. And she is one of the early people to start to describe this. Then in 1936, she ended up going to the University of Missouri and being kind of recruited there. And through this, as she's continuing to work with chromosomes, she is introduced to X-rays to help her understand more of her genetic work, and thus being able to use X-rays to increase mutation rates and see what was going on. And so then by 1938, she is able to help explain and wrote out what they call as the breakage-fusage bridge cycle, aka when there is this mutation that happens within cells, and in this case because of X-rays, but that the chromosomes are not necessarily splitting in the typical way, how they kind of go through these different processes to at least be able to have one good chromosome to be able to make pairs off of, so that you're able to get through this weird genetic mutation or weird breakage that they have. It's really fascinating. I'll attach some links down below that kind of show that a little bit further. But she didn't stop there. When she realized in about 1940 that she wasn't ever going to get tenure at Missouri, she then ended up moving to the Carnegie Institute, which was part of Washington's Department of Genetics in Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in Long Island, New York. And it was there where she really took her research, I would say, to the next level. She, in the late 1940s, started coming out with what she was finding as controlling elements. That she was noticing that there was transportable parts to the genetic code, aka that these elements would move along the chromosome, aka jumping genes. And this would change along the position or move along the chromosome, and this would generate some different things. One of the big things that she was kind of looking at when she was looking at corn is why within Indian corn were you getting different colors for different kernels, what was going on, and recognizing specifically these more white with speckled ones was where it fell, this jumping transportable gene fell in the middle of where it was coding for color. And that this gene was being dropped in the middle of it, thus disrupting the ability to have a solid color because of how this jumping gene was being expressed. She was believing, because of this transportable gene, that this is partially how we have the same genetic material, and thus it's able to create muscles and tissues and more complex organisms. Then in 1951, she was able to state then through this that there are these genes that can be silenced by elements, is what she called, later to be discovered to be enzymes, thus being able to turn off and turn on certain genes at different times. And as this stuff is coming out in 1951, scientists basically laughed her out of all their communities, stating that this is very skeptical, and they were criticizing her because she was a woman in particular. This gets her to the point that in 1953, she just quit publishing her work. It's not that she quit doing it. She just quit publishing it because there was nothing productive that was coming out of it. Everybody was just complaining and telling her she's nuts, telling her that this is nothing. In the early 1960s, there was two French scientists who came out with the theory of genetic variation. She then wrote a paper stating, hey, take a look at some of the papers that I was writing in the late 1940s. They seem very similar. And by golly, it was then at that point that they were able to start recognizing what she was doing, and more scientists were able to look deeper at what she was doing in the late 60s and into the 70s to recognize what she was describing in the late 40s that she was seeing through her microscope. This led to, in 1983, getting the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. She is the only woman to win it without sharing it, that she won it solo, that she isn't part of a group. She got it solo, and she got it for her transportable gene element. And unfortunately, this was something that she was a little bit disappointed because she thought it was more worthy to get it for the controlling elements or the enzymes that were turning on and off the different genetic material. She thought that was more worthy of a Nobel Prize than having these jumping genes going back and forth. So what do we have here? We have a woman who is 15 to 20 years ahead of where everybody else is within the field. And in doing that, recognizing that this doesn't mean that I quit doing research. She didn't quit. She kept doing her research. It's just, okay, I'm not going to publish it. You're not ready for what I am working on. You haven't gotten to the point where you're understanding what I'm doing. And what I'm seeing under the microscope and what I'm understanding as I'm looking at these slides, looking at these chromosomes, seeing how they're breaking apart, being able to document and map out these corn cells and being able to look at specific traits along that corn cell and understanding how they're splitting apart and how that's relating and how that's changing things within these Indian corns is phenomenal. You're just not understanding it. And that's not going to stop me from what I'm doing. And when the science finally caught up, the rest of the scientific community, that's when she was able to start showing her work. It more related, it provided additional support, and thus she got her roses at the end of her life. And in certain ways, Gregor Mendel went through the same thing. Gregor Mendel, who is the father of genetics, goes through, does all these things, and then when he's trying to reconfirm his stuff, he uses a weed that ends up being asexual, Haggai. And he then became the leader of an abbey. So he became busy with other things and he wasn't able to continue pushing and working on his science. And so thus it kind of sat there. And Mendel, after he's long gone, gets his roses for the work that Gregor Mendel did. These are ways of us being able to understand that this is the blessing and the curse sometimes of science. That sometimes we're ahead of where people are at and you have to try to catch them up. And you can't necessarily say that they're lunatics, say that they're crazy. You have to still try to take it in and recognize that that is a potential reality of where we're moving. It's potential understanding. It's thus why there are lots of theories in science, not very many scientific laws on this is the way. These are ideas on how we think things happen. We can give more and more support to something, but very few things ever make it over to scientific law. When we look at these texts, we have to remember that there's a lot of things that are worthy of giving God praise. There are a lot of things within life that we need to continue to turn to God and look to God for guidance, for help, for understanding. That doesn't mean that we necessarily have to agree with what God is saying. It doesn't mean that we necessarily fully understand at that time and at that place what God is saying either. There's sometimes that God's saying, you're not seeing the full picture. You're not understanding the whole picture. You have to trust me. The way that you're looking at things, the way that you're understanding things is good for where you're at right now, but that's not where you will forever be. You're going to have to keep growing, getting back to the question that we had for last week. And I think in a lot of ways, that's one of the things that I think, at least here in the United States, I think that is a question that we are dealing with as a broader church. Is this recognition that we have to understand that we have to keep growing in our faith. And that sometimes means that we need to be challenging what we understand as what God is saying or how we are reading that text, and sometimes have to hear difficult things, difficult counter arguments, and really go deep within ourselves to work those through to understand where we're at and being able to have communities work together to go through these things. It's not necessarily victimizing one side or the other side. It means working through them together. And that as we slowly work together more and more, the light of what God is trying to say, I think, does come through. And I think it's something that as I look for the world, I think there's a lot of times we're really struggling with that at this time and in this place. We have to continue to listen to even arguments that ways that people are interpreting scripture that are different than us and see those challenges as good things. Barbara McClintock offered things that were way different than what people were understanding at the time. And it didn't stop her when people said no. She just said, okay, fine. You're not ready for what I'm doing. I just won't publish. But I'm going to keep working and keep studying this. And when that time came, then thus, yes, I've continued working on this. This is what I've understood. This is where I was at this point, but this is where I'm at now. We have to understand that within faith. And if we don't, we're stuck in the mud, and that's a dangerous place to be, thinking that I understand it all and thus I don't need to move. That's extremely dangerous. Because then I would argue you are seeing yourself as God and thus you do not need to continue to grow. And I don't know where you're at. Because how I understand things, I have to keep growing because I still have so much to understand. There's still ways my spouse continues to surprise me even though I've known her for years. There's still ways that my parents surprise me that I still continue to grow and learn about them. There's still a way my sister continues to surprise me as I continue to grow and understand who she is. I continue to grow and change as myself. Why would I think that I suddenly fully understand who God is all the time? Just because someone is putting something out that challenges what my understandings are at that place doesn't mean that they are something worth victimizing. It means that maybe this is an opportunity for me to work on listening and work on gathering information and continuing to work that out and figuring out even within myself where I'm at, and continue to work with people who know more than I do. Continue to talk with people and see what their understandings are to continue to help you as an individual, but also as a group, form our understanding of things. So the question I have for you this week is, where are you being challenged to grow? Where are you being challenged to grow? Because Barbara McClintock was challenged in the aspect that people were saying, no, your stuff is wrong, you're crazy. And that didn't stop her in this case, because for her, there was enough there. Fine, I just won't talk about it. I won't put that out there. And when you get to that point, I'll have that stuff for you. I'll still keep my notes. I'll still keep my things together. And when the science caught up to where she was, thus they ended up at the end of her life recognizing the things that she had done. And sometimes there's people that, yes, we think we find something, and the further we dig into it, it really doesn't amount to anything. And then we have to be able to admit that we are wrong. And that's why, again, we're making scientific theories, not scientific laws. And we recognize that sometimes over time, these different theories that looked really good fail. And that's okay too. The understanding of how the world has worked, the understanding of how faith works, the understanding of who God is has continued to evolve and change over time. And we have to be willing and able to do that as well. God wants a relationship that goes deeper and deeper. And just like your relationships with friends and family change over time, so should our relationship with God, because it's getting deeper as we get to grow in our understanding of who God is. And I think it's really easy for us to fall into the trap of, well, this is what I understand. This is the way I think about it. So thus, this is the way that it is. And then we stop. And if we're preaching something like that, I think that's where it becomes so dangerous, because it's not a growth mindset. And this idea of us growing in the faith is something that is inherent to, I would argue, our Christian walk. And that we should be allowing ourselves to be challenged in our ideas and how we understand our faith in and of itself. That we should be wanting to have conversations that sometimes are really difficult with talking about our faith, so that we can all go deeper and grow further and being able to understand that more completely. And maybe we don't come to consensus, and that's okay. But I think it's really important for us to be able to do that. But that also means we need to be able to have civilized conversations. It's not going in and saying, I'm right, you're wrong. Because look what that did for Barbara McClintock. That didn't help her. That actually prevented her from providing more research. And who knows that maybe we've actually would have gotten further if we were able to continue to see what she was putting out, even though the scientific community didn't think it was necessarily great at the time. But yet we come around to it as more and more things are exposed and understood, as in this case, some of the technology allowed for deeper understanding. It's really easy for us to put the blinders on and say, this is the way that I believe, this is the way that I think about it, this is the way I understand things. And I think Jesus is calling that out. And in doing that, it makes it really easy for us to forget our past, forget what we've gone through, forget what we see in other parts of Scripture, and just get focused in on the verses and sections that we are familiar with and support what we wanted to see. And I think it's a warning of, yes, as we are seeking truth, there's times where it's difficult, like we hear in 2 Thessalonians this week. But that means that we still have to keep seeking God and keep looking through the whole thing, keep looking at all of it, trying to look at all the different theories, even the ones that seem crazy to us. And maybe there are ways that we can say, yep, that one we're putting aside because there's just things that doesn't work. And that's fine. And maybe they don't work for this time. Maybe at some point we circle back. Sometimes maybe we won't. But we have to be able to take that stuff in, because if we don't, we really don't grow. And if we're trying to grow, if we're trying to understand like what Barbara McClintock is laying down 15 to 20 years before people are ready to hear it, we then never get to that place where we're actually able to hear it and understand and see what Barbara was actually seeing and understand what she was seeing and understanding. And in a lot of ways, if we allow ourselves to get to that place, I think we actually get to start to fully understand different aspects and more of the image of who God is. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.